Beirut was my entry point to the Middle East, and I was interested in intergenerational memory among Lebanese youth that were coming out of the civil war. So these are young people that didn't experience the civil war, but were living with the consequences of it. And I was curious, maybe perhaps because of my own background from Belfast, also at the end of the Troubles, and the fact that we were in a society that was very much silencing the past publicly, but privately, memory was everywhere.
Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Dr. Craig Larkin, Director of the Center for the Study of Divided Societies at King's College London. Larkin is also a research lead on memory and conflict for XCEPT, a research consortium studying cross-border conflict. There, he focuses on the relationship between communal memory and violence. Together, we unpack different approaches taken to reconstruction and reconciliation after violence in the Middle East. And then in his farewell Babel appearance, Martin Pimentel takes my spot, continuing the conversation with Ninar, Fawal, and Todman to discuss pitfalls the international community should avoid when supporting post-conflict recovery. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Craig Larkin, welcome to Babel.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You've written a lot about social reconstruction in conflict-affected environments. What is social reconstruction? What are its components?
I've been really interested in the intersection of memory, conflict, and identity, and particularly looking at how cities can be both destroyed and then they attempt to rebuild and reconstruct. And I suppose I've been interested, while there's been a lot of focus on physical rebuilding, on the restoration of society, I would argue there's been not enough focus on how do communities heal? How can you reintegrate communities and people after conflict? So I would say social reconstruction is one of my Iraqi interviews said. It's not about rebuilding the stones, it's about rebuilding the people.
You know, in a lot of conflict-affected environments, there are a lot of pre-existing power structures, like tribal leaders, sectarian leaders, some of whom may have contributed to the violence in the first place. How do you think about their roles? I mean, it seems to me that in some ways, having these kinds of leaders can help you get things moving in the near term, but it can also plant the seeds of division in the longer term.
The reality is, after conflict and war, we have a post-war status quo that perhaps has integrated hierarchies or integrated inequalities. So any type of process of moving a society forward has to deal with what the war has left behind and how do you deal with political elites, whether it's been my work in Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, or Iraq. It's a very difficult challenge of negotiating those hierarchies and power structures, but also recognizing that they are a consequence and a result of violence. So perhaps the violence has created new elites and new hierarchies that you don't want to consolidate, that you want to attempt to sort of create a more egalitarian society. In many post-conflict settings, that's not viable. So I think there's all sorts of moral questions of who you should be speaking to, who you should be funding.
How do you think about it? What are the limits to what you should allow, and what are the alternative arrangements that emerge?
We have to be very open with our approach. We need to talk to local inhabitants and not a certain social norms. I was struck by the sort of peace-building jargon even around forgiveness and reconciliation that was controversial in certain communities, particularly from a Western prescribed idea. And I think it's useful to ask local communities what they actually believe transitional justice should look like. What do they prioritize? Now, again, this went back to Reconstruction, where there was a pushback in Iraq on the question of timing. Should the focus be on perhaps the reconstruction of key symbolic sites or monuments, as opposed to infrastructure rebuilding, as opposed to rebuilding houses, hospitals, social services? Instead, the Western international community focused on cultural heritage, focused on monumental rebuilding of the mosques, the churches, the sacred sites, when many Moslawis, many Iraqis wanted, the focus was on everyday life, the focus was on service provision. That's one factor, that we need better engagement with local communities. We also need a greater sensitivity to the language and culture and conceptual differences. So to be open that we're not sort of imposing new neoliberal, neocolonial frameworks.
In your experience, are a lot of Iraqis or other people in these conflict-affected environments interested in the ideas you have about social reconstruction, or are they interested in services, infrastructure, more tangible things? How much support is there for some of the softer ideas that you think are important?
What you can see is mobilization around grassroots issues. So I take Mosul, for example, that has been a site that I've focused on quite a lot of research with the XCEPT project. While UNESCO's vision was for reviving the spirit of Mosul, I mean, an excellent idea. This was one of Iraq's most cosmopolitan cities, destroyed by ISIS, where minorities were displaced and killed. And the idea of reuniting the city, of reconstructing the mosques and churches, were valued. But what was also very significant were the local grassroots initiatives of heritage homes, local initiatives around rebuilding the souks, the marketplaces, because there's a recognition that they can't just wait on the symbolic large sites to be built. They needed everyday spaces to allow people to interact, to allow people to reimagine their city and to engage with each other. And that is happening on a grassroots level. There's great mobilization, particularly among Moslawi youth that want to move beyond the trauma and violence of the past, but need some help in the direction that they're heading.
How does the international community play in this space? Clearly, there are people who have business interests that they want to advance, and they love international money to help them do it. There are sectarian leaders who want to have more money that they can direct to their people. There are local business folks who see their own compelling business reasons for rebuilding one thing or another. How should the international community think about untangling the different motivations and the different needs of a community that in many ways understands each other much better than anybody on the outside could ever understand them?
Sometimes I think it comes down to the funding direction and how the West creates large-scale projects that then trickle down, where there's always room then for corruption. I think it should be reversed, and there should be greater funding of grassroots, local-led initiatives that are not just based on very small 2-year projects, but have got greater longevity. I would suggest the investment in local people, local activists, and those that are willing, that have invested in their community, that are committed to their community, and not in the sort of professionalization of NGO and NGO class. But in fact, we should go back to grassroots initiatives. Of course, I'm not naive to the complexities of that, the reality that there will be opportunities for corruption, opportunities for manipulation, but also there's great potential within that if we go back to a grassroots approach, if we fund from below, if we try to encourage local communities, and also just to capture the different visions that many of these organizations have for their communities. The reality is I think again of Iraq and Nineveh Plains, this is a complex, multi-ethnic community that have suffered in different ways, and therefore the tensions are not always felt around religious division. I would say right now in Mosul, there's greater intra-religious division between Sunni community, between those that have been displaced, the newcomers. In fact, some of this is class-based. So part of the problem comes from a very much Western reading that is often sectarian-driven, that is often ethnic focused, when in fact we need to have a finer grain understanding that there's class dynamics at play, that there's issues of displacement and how communities can be reintegrated, or whether they should be reintegrated into those particular cities or spaces that they've been forced out of.
As you think about a smaller scale bottom up process, is there a place you think it's been done especially well, where the international community or support from the international community was able to catalyze something that was really important, really durable, went very much in the right direction?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think it's easier to pick out spaces that haven't been done very well than to pick out success stories. I would go back to Beirut. That was the start of my research many years ago on sort of memory and conflict. And I think that downtown Beirut is a good example of a space that was not constructed well, that became incredibly elitist, exclusive. This was the downtown Solidaire's project that even now it's still sort of barricaded off. And for many Lebanese, they feel dislocated from that center. So it's a good example of where Mosul in Iraq shouldn't go in the rebuilding project. In other words, this vision was very much based on creating a commodified cosmopolitan center that would be funded basically by tourism. And it excluded many Lebanese who couldn't afford to live there, who couldn't afford to shop there, and excluded them from their center where it used to be a meeting place. It used to be a pluralistic center. Mosul, the danger would be, and sometimes this is happening a little bit in Baghdad, the funding of these huge malls like Western shopping malls, as opposed to the older souks that were more informal, that they had much better interaction between communities. So in Mosul, I think there is an opportunity to fund the local souks that help to network and knit communities together, as opposed to these grander shopping centers that very often can just be linked to political elites and can be linked to wealthy entrepreneurs. So in Mosul, we are beginning to see localized activists that are trying to reclaim the city. But of course, this is against the backdrop of political uncertainty and violence in the region, which makes any type of reconstruction very hard.
But as I think back to American cities, as I think to Middle Eastern cities that I know, a process of renovation almost necessarily involves gentrification as a way to finance the renovation, and people who were more marginal get squeezed out. I say, is there an example of doing this in a very different way? I think of Faneuil Hall in Boston, all the example of the Inner Harbor in Baltimore, Maryland. All the examples seem to involve taking what is considered to be urban blight, creating infrastructure, creating transportation so people can come in, and creating some sort of commercial viability that can then spawn other areas where, again, traditional communities adapt. Some people get jobs, some people have to move. I mean, is that a necessary part of Reconstruction?
I think the gentrification of cities in the West is almost an inevitable consequence. You know, I grew up in Belfast, and what we see is the gentrification of downtown Belfast. What becomes more complex, I would say, and Belfast is an example, when you have a divided city inside a contested state, the marginalization of communities goes beyond just a class-based issue. This then can lead to greater instability. So for Beirut, the fact that Solidaire had a very sort of gentrification model, that might be okay, but it becomes problematic in a Lebanese state that is based on power sharing, that is based on sort of intercommunal arrangements, and therefore the exclusion of particular communities from that center is problematic. And I think that's what marks it differently to Western gentrification. We're not just talking about gentrification. We're talking about probably the sort of consolidation of sectarian elites and exclusion and marginalization that can have a destabilizing effect on the future. So I would see in my work on Lebanon, young people felt like they were excluded and marginalized from the center, that they didn't have a space where they could interact, that they could come together. And therefore, it continued to be contested. The public protests, we go back to Thawra in 2019, the Lebanese sort of uprising against the sectarian elite. This was also an attempt to reclaim the city, an attempt to reclaim the spaces that youth felt marginalized from, that youth felt that they had no place within that city. And similar processes happen in Baghdad at the same time, a protest against the political elite and corruption. but also about housing, about social provision, about welfare. I would call this in Lefebvre in terms of the right to the city, to actually belong there and to have space within these cities.
So how much similarity do you see across the Middle East, which has, as you know, a wide range of conflict-affected societies? To what extent are the problems similar? Do they rhyme? And what are the key differences that you see from site to site?
Beirut was my entry point to the Middle East, and I was interested in intergenerational memory among Lebanese youth that were coming out of the civil war. So these are young people that didn't experience the civil war, but were living with the consequences of it. And I was curious, maybe perhaps because of my own background from Belfast, also at the end of the Troubles, and the fact that we were in a society that was very much silencing the past publicly, but privately, memory was everywhere. Stories were told, history and traumatic events were reworked and relived through narratives and through particular sites. I felt that in Lebanon, that young people were struggling to process the public silences and an attempt at amnesia after the war and the reality that they lived in a divided society, that the street, the school, the neighborhood that they grew up in was very often segregated, that the war was not taught in their education syllabus, but yet it was lived out in everyday life. So the memory component there was very much about the continuation of war memory. That then moved me to understand how memory can also be embedded within the urban landscape of memoryscape. So part of that reconstruction process. So whenever later I went to look at work in Iraq, again, the issue of memory of what happens after herbicide, after your city is destroyed purposely. How do you reimagine the past? How do you live with that past when there's competing memories and competing actors that have got a very clear vision for the future? So I've always been interested, and I think it's very different. Memory is an ambivalent concept and is an ambivalent tool of analysis, but we can see how more recently it can be weaponized and politicized and can lead to all sorts of divisions. But likewise, I found that there's an opportunity to address the past, acknowledge the past, create a space for dialogue and encounter. So my research has always held that ambivalence of memory and conflict, that it's not just a catalyst for future violence, but it's a lens for understanding how people are interpreting the past to try to deal with their present demands and their future vision.
How does all of that affect how you think government should think about the reconstruction of Gaza, which itself was a complex society with people displaced from different parts of historic Palestine, different kinds of divisions inside, a huge amount of physical reconstruction that needs to be done? What's the advice you would give, not being a Gaza expert, but having thought through these processes, that people need to put front of mind that probably isn't front of mind?
What's happened, I would say, in Gaza is not just herbicide, but more than likely moving towards genocide, or herbicide is part of a genocidal attack. So there's a purposeful focus and structural attack on destroying Palestinian life there, cultural heritage, mosques, museums, churches. And that will be part of the rehabilitation, the reconstruction. It's not just about Gazans as a people, but Palestinian cultural heritage and identity that has developed over hundreds of years in that area. So very often there's a reduction to Gazan people or Palestinians in the Gazan Strip, as if the reconstruction is just about their homes, is just about, they can be moved around, or there's no attempt to bring them back into that space. But I think if we want to envision a future for Gazans, it needs to be a complete reconstruction, not just of housing, not just on social services, but on their cultural heritage. That is going to be very difficult, but I think it's very necessary.
Let me ask a hard question, which I think as somebody who grew up in Belfast, you must have an especially nuanced understanding of. How can you tell whether the kinds of things you're recommending are working?
It's very difficult to say how effective such policy decisions are. I think we can clearly see where there's been dangerous consequences, perhaps because they're not properly thought through. And my work would point to that memory needs to be understood in its entirety, and there is danger whenever we try to silence it. These silences are often very noisy, so there's a generational component that it might look like a cold peace. It might look like societies are healing. I'd come back to the Belfast example, and while there hasn't been concerted violence for over a decade, it does not mean that the societies are integrated. Education's 93% segregated. People live in segregated communities. Paramilitaries still function in some way as criminal gangs. There's challenge to state authorities. There's many things that have not been resolved inside this cold peace in the Good Friday Agreement. And that's where I believe we need to go back to deal with memory of the Troubles, open up what's actually happened. Similarly, in Lebanon, it's very clear, well, there's been multiple cycles of violence. We're almost up to the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975, but there's been multiple conflicts, Israeli war in 2006, ongoing Israeli attacks to the port explosion, Thawra. And these are cumulative traumas that affect Lebanese society, and they don't replace the last trauma. They're embedded. They add to it. I was interviewing ex-Islamists from Rumi prison in Lebanon, mostly from Tripoli, and these are ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra fighters. We interviewed about 40 ex-prisoners that were fighting in Syria, and I was curious to understand their motivation. For many, the historic memory of violence and their upbringing in Tripoli and Lebanon had a mobilizing component. The historic violence of the past has real life consequences and realities on the present. So I think that's where there is policy relevance to say very often we just want to focus on the current issue, but we don't want to address some of the deeper historic issues.
It seems to me that as I think about the places you study, what we now think of as what were successful models of coexistence themselves emerged from earlier cycles of violence in earlier centuries without the kinds of solutions you're describing. That there are some communities, whether it's Baghdad, Jerusalem, cities that have had histories of remarkable cosmopolitanism and coexistence, which broke down into cycles of horrific violence, exile, massacres, and then were able to reconstruct and create these cosmopolitan societies again, which now people look back and say, if we could only recapture that moment. In that kind of environment where we almost have cyclical violence and cosmopolitan coexistence, how should we think about what success really looks like? How long should we think success would last?
It could be easy to sort of read this as a romanticization or a nostalgia for a previous mixed past, but that's embedded in the historical memory of the communities as well, that they live together, they work together, and they're very much Moslawis or Beirutis or Jerusalemites. There's a shared cultural heritage that needs to be encouraged, but that doesn't mean that you neglect what led to a rupture. So I think that came through in some of the work on Mosul, that the focus can be about reviving a unified past. But unless you address how ISIS emerged, why they emerged, and what some of the underlying factors were for that emergence, then it can lead to cycles of violence again. So you almost approach the past with that double-handed approach of the unifying cosmopolitanism, but trying to grapple with what destabilizes that. What are the factors that cause the fragmentation within society? And can they be critically addressed? Can they be addressed in a way that better integrates and unifies? I would say Lebanon is a perfect example of society that's got such a rich cultural heritage of cosmopolitanism. But right now in schools, they're not teaching their students any history of the Civil War. up to current politics. It's too controversial. They can't agree it. And I think that is a little bit dangerous. I think there has to be an attempt to at least allow students to grapple with the different narratives to try to understand, or it can easily be mobilized again. And the same critique that I would have for Lebanon, I would have for my own community. Similarly, there is no teaching on the Troubles within most schools in a Northern Irish context.
So let me close with a question on what outsiders really can do. You're describing processes that have very deep roots, people who have tremendous stakes, not only for their children, but their grandchildren, and an international community whose attention is often not sustained, and that often moves from issue to issue. How can the international community maximize its constructive impact when in so many ways its input is transient?
We're trying to deal with a dynamic and moving situation, and very often the international community lack focus, lack a willingness to commit to particular projects. And I think that's a reality, particularly if this political moment that we find ourselves. There's probably a retreat from an international vision to intervene in such communities. But I would push back against that. And I think there is still an important role for international community and actors to support and to work alongside communities. And this is part of a peace building process. This is part of helping towards a transitional justice that doesn't conform to a very structured Western approach, but encourages a more contextual, local partnership to help communities move forward together and to be able to work collaboratively.
Craig Larkin, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
What are some potentially distorting or disruptive effects of outside aid on reconstruction? How do we navigate local politics to ensure that aid is having the desired effects on the right people?
Well, anytime you put a lot of money into a fragile and conflict-affected environment, there's going to be unintended consequences. One of the issues that often happens, as Dr. Larkin mentioned, is this challenge of mismatched priorities, that there are international actors who come in with an understanding of what needs to be done in this environment, but those are not necessarily aligned with the needs or the understandings of the people on the ground. I think in particular, like in a fragile environment, you see variation across different regions, territories that have different modes of governance, different levels of fragility, different knock-on effects of the conflict itself. And you often see international actors come in with a sort of national level plan for how to reconstruct a country. And I think that can fail at more local levels. A second challenge that you see is profit motives shaping the way in which reconstruction takes place. This is one of the risks that we are already starting to witness right now in the context of Syria. For example, you see countries like the UAE and Turkey planning how to bring in their own domestic businesses to reconstruct certain parts of the country. And I think what we'll see is that there is going to be a focus on areas of the country that are most likely to expand economic engagement, for example, between Turkey or the UAE and Syria. So that might focus on critical infrastructure, ports, roads, things of that nature. But there are other parts of the country that also have really important reconstruction needs. For example, in agricultural areas where there are enormous quantities of unexploded ordnance. That's going to require enormous amounts of money, enormous amounts of manpower through reconstruction to be able to make these areas farmable again. But there are less economic incentives for international actors to intervene in that particular respect. And so I think that will shape the way in which reconstruction ends up playing out.
Definitely. I think aid by its very nature is distorting. When you have a huge amount of money coming in externally, that changes the balance of power. It changes depending on what it's spent on, where it's spent, who is spending it. And so I think it is impossible for it not to be distorting. But I think in addition to all the ways that Marty laid out, it has a distorting effect on the labor market as well. A huge influx of contracts or money in a certain sector, like the construction sector, perhaps in Lebanon at the moment. Reconstruction is not yet fully underway, but when it does come underway, companies working in concrete or in windows, in glass, will really benefit from this. And so it has an effect that people will shift and businesses will shift to try to access these opportunities. And then later on in the process as well, there are the distorting effects of salaries of those who are involved in the aid process. So quite often, people who work for international NGOs or even directly for international donors have huge salaries in comparison to a lot of people in the local market. And there are times when this is hugely distorting. So in Lebanon, again, because of the collapse of the currency, if you are paid in US dollars, then you are doing relatively well in Lebanon right now. Your money goes a lot further. Whereas if you're still paid in Lebanese lira, then your salary has lost a huge percentage of its worth. So I think there are a whole host of ways in which this is distorting, and there are real political effects of that.
I also think that one of the implications of the complexity of Reconstruction is that monitoring evaluation becomes really important. Just because there are unintended side effects to Reconstruction doesn't mean that we ought not to do it, but it does mean that we should be careful about how we do it and recognize when things are going in a way that we didn't anticipate to begin with. But that leads to challenges when we try to implement Reconstruction at a more localized level, as Dr. Larkin mentioned. The problem with utilizing local actors is that they have less capacity to monitor and evaluate in the way in which international actors typically conceptualize doing so. And so I think one of the challenges that the international community needs to grapple with is how can we continue to localize Reconstruction efforts, bring in local perspectives to guide the priorities of international actors in Reconstruction, but also do so in a way that is mindful of the need to monitor unintended side effects and finding creative new ways that we can do so that meets the capacity of local actors.
On that note, how can local actors leverage and at times manipulate foreign actors when it comes to Reconstruction? What kinds of tools do they use to do so?
They have a lot of choices as well. They can choose the kinds of Reconstruction activities that they get involved in. As Marty was saying, infrastructure projects are really lucrative. They might be incentivized to get involved in those over working on governance reforms, things like that, which are much less lucrative and a more challenging process to work through in many ways. They also have the ability to play different donors off against each other. Sometimes there are multiple donors that are really keen to engage in an area, and they might not all have the same priorities. And that can even involve some extent of great power competition. I mean, China is involved in certain aspects of Reconstruction, and maybe the Chinese proposition is much more attractive to some people who don't want to see the same kinds of conditionality that we traditionally associate with Western donors. They also have a lot of bureaucratic tools at their disposal to be able to shape and distort the kinds of projects they get. Government officials can deny permissions for projects in certain areas or deny visas for those who want to come and work on them in order to prioritize and shift aid towards other areas. And then physical control and security control is also a tool that they have. Somewhere like southern Lebanon, until recently, Hezbollah exerted a huge amount of influence over who goes there, which kinds of international aid actors can access parts of southern Lebanon. And so they can then force themselves to be intermediaries that can help bolster their own credibility. Or if they choose not to act as an intermediary, then they can at least prevent the influence of others that might be trying to undermine their influence or their grip on power there.
I also think it's important to differentiate what kinds of local actors we're talking about. In most post-conflict environments, when Reconstruction starts, the conflict isn't always over. These things tend to continue. And we see this in Lebanon, we've seen it in Syria, where there is still low-level conflict. There is control by non-state armed groups. In fact, the ICRC has found that 40 million people in the Middle East and North Africa live in territory that's controlled by non-state armed groups. And so even in quote-unquote post-conflict settings, we often find that Reconstruction is shaped by ongoing conflict dynamics. And so these groups have particular mechanisms by which they can shape methods of Reconstruction, partly because they control territory, and so they can decide who is or is not allowed to conduct Reconstruction work in this particular territory. They're also seen as security guarantors in some contexts, and so they may be seen as reliable security partners in order to prevent the outbreak of violence. So they can use that leverage to then dictate what kinds of Reconstruction is or is not permissible in these areas. And they also have, in some cases, an economic influence as well. A lot of the times, these militias or other armed groups are also integrated into illicit economies and have substantial economic influence that then allows them to shape Reconstruction efforts. And so when you are building a new economy in these areas, you have to deal with people who are already embedded in systems that they have an incentive to maintain.
Let's shift now to social reconstruction. What can successful social reconstruction look like in post-conflict settings across the region? What roles do, for example, urban renewal or religious and ethnic diversity play?
I think what makes social reconstruction such an interesting concept is because it can mean so many different things depending on the particular moment and the particular people that you're talking about. I think one of the ways in which we have seen social reconstruction play out beyond just the dimension of urban reconstruction is an artistic expression as well. Dr. Larkin speaks quite a bit about the role of mosques and souks and communal places for people to meet together as a form of social reconstruction and rehabilitating social ties. I think music can also play another role in that as well. There are different kinds of social interactions, like music, like art. We recently had someone on Babel that spoke about urban art as well at large scales and how this can be a mechanism for creating new kinds of communal ties and raising issues that are difficult to speak about in other contexts. And so I think we have seen that in many places. Afghanistan is one in which artists have played a particular role in social mobilization and reflecting the needs of communities. I also think that with social reconstruction, it really is where if the rubber meets the road in terms of ideology and more pragmatic concerns about reconstruction. For me, I think about the differential outcomes between Turkey and Morocco in terms of nation building, resolving ethnic differences. In Turkey, you had a very particular mode of nation building after their own revolution, which was very much predicated on a modern concept of Turkey that was different than the ways in which the Kurdish population conceptualized their own identity. And it necessitated in the minds of the Turkish government reforming or changing the ways in which Kurdish people spoke and presented themselves. Whereas in North Africa, you saw a different dynamic where in Morocco, for example, social ties were predicated more on religion rather than on ethnic difference. And so it was a way in which the Moroccan monarchy was able to move past differences between its Arab population and its Amazigh population. Now, this wasn't a perfect process, but it does show how conceptualizing what a society and a community means and looking for areas of commonality can be a way to move past situations in which you have heterogeneity in other contexts.
I'm also really intrigued by this idea of social reconstruction, and some of this comes down to the perceptions of the choices that people make when they are prioritizing what gets reconstructed and what doesn't. There are so many opportunities for certain groups to feel that they are being marginalized, that their needs are not being prioritized over the needs of others. One piece of this is ensuring as much as possible that aspects of different communities, cultural sites are being simultaneously addressed. And Dr. Larkin talked a bit about Mosul, and I think Mosul is a really interesting example here. They simultaneously reconstructed churches in old Mosul alongside the Nouri Mosque, it had a famous minaret that was leaning. And this actually gave Mosul its nickname. So the people from Mosul are called Al-Hadba, which is something like the hunchback. And it's a hugely culturally significant landmark that ISIS destroyed. It has now been completely reconstructed. And I think that plays into this feeling that not only were Christians and Muslims simultaneously received the benefits of reconstruction, but also it's this symbol that can come to stoke pride and a sense of rebirth among the people who live there. I think there's also something about shared spaces. And when some cities have been rebuilt, they have purposefully added in communal spaces that are designed to be accessible for all. Going back to Beirut, Dr. Larkin used the example of Solidaire being a really exclusionary area. There's also a huge park in the middle of Beirut, which is completely cut off to everyone. Someone once told me that only foreigners can go there. If you show your foreign passport, you can go, but no Lebanese can go inside. More recently, there has been more of a push towards building spaces where people can have interactions from different kinds of social classes and backgrounds. And then just finally, as he mentioned, I think educational curricula, museums, these play a huge role as well. And it is so important to think through what people are told about their past. Dr. Larkin mentioned about some of the pieces that are not talked about in Northern Ireland. I will say, as someone who grew up going to a British school, there are huge amounts of British history, often involving war, that we just did not learn about as well. And it was really sort of a shamefully late stage in my life that I learned about some of this. And that really does shape your identity. And so I think museums and curricula are another really key piece of this social reconstruction idea.
Part of what you just mentioned, Will, is how long it can take to fill some of these gaps. Social reconstruction, just like physical reconstruction, is not a process that will take 6 months or a year or 2 years. It's an ongoing process, and it's a generational project, particularly for severe conflicts. And one of the challenges that the international community will have to face is how to develop long-term thinking about reconstruction in a moment where there are so many different conflicts going on and it's so hard to maintain focus on things. And one of the benefits of the shock to the international aid system that's going on right now is that there is a real focus on figuring out how can we build durable projects, work on durable reconstruction that can exist even in the face of shocks to international aid. And this is one of those questions that is really front and center for people working on these issues right now. And one of the benefits of social reconstruction, I think, is that it allows people to buy into the project themselves at the local level. I think that has the benefit of creating at least the potential for a more sustainable mode of reconstruction over time.
Marty, Will, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ninar.
Thank you, Ninar.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.